Not everyone is born to become an empath, but most empaths are born from a crack that no one can see. There are people who enter life with a layer of emotional skin so thin that the world does not leave scratches on them. It leaves aftershocks. They do not only hear words, they hear the silence behind them. They do not only look at faces, they see the emotions trying to hide in the eyes. From a very young age, they know what is about to happen simply by feeling the atmosphere in the room shift. No one teaches them this. Their bodies learn on their own, because if they do not learn, they will not be safe. The childhood of an empath is rarely loud. It is often quiet. A long-lasting silence, where the child learns to observe instead of asking, learns to listen instead of speaking, learns to feel instead of being felt. It may be a home where love comes and goes without warning. It may be adults carrying their own exhaustion, leaving the child to navigate emotions that have not yet been named. And in that instability, the empath begins to develop a very refined survival skill, reading others before others even understand themselves. They learn to guess whether that voice today carries anger or not. They learn to recognize disappointment before it turns into blame. They learn to soften the atmosphere through obedience, through not causing trouble, through becoming the most agreeable person in the room. Not because they want praise, but because they need peace in order to survive. Gradually, sensing others becomes a reflex, like breathing. They cannot name what it is. They only know that if they do not feel, they will be lost. Years pass, and that child grows up. The wound does not disappear, but it changes shape. What was once fear becomes intuition. What was once vigilance becomes empathy. The grown empath steps into the world with an open heart, not because they are naive, but because they are deeply familiar with living without fences. They feel the sadness of the person in front of them before that person even realizes they are sad. They listen with their whole body, not just their ears, and they offer that presence naturally, as if it is simply what must be done. That presence creates a very strange kind of light. It is not loud, it does not seek attention, but it is enough to make others feel seen. When an empath enters a relationship, they bring an unprepared honesty with them. They do not know how to wear masks, because from childhood they have lived by feeling rather than hiding. They show up exactly as they are, with raw emotions, with vulnerability that asks no permission, and that, for some people, is both comforting and unsettling. At first, people are drawn in. There is something very safe about being near an empath. Others feel heard without being judged, understood without needing to explain too much. Empaths do not try to fix anyone, but their presence allows others to reveal themselves. Hidden stories are spoken. Long-buried emotions are allowed to rise. The empath becomes a shelter, a place where others can set down the burdens they have carried for many years. But not all closeness is born from the capacity to love. Some connections are formed from need, when the other person slowly realizes that they need the presence of the empath to feel more whole. A quiet tension begins to appear. Because empaths do not only bring comfort, they also bring a mirror. And, in that mirror, others see parts of themselves they have avoided for a very long time. The emptiness, the shallowness, the distance between who they present themselves as and who they truly are. Empaths do not say this out loud. They do not need to. Their presence alone is enough, and sometimes, that alone is enough to make the other person's defenses begin to shake. The other feels uneasy without knowing why. The initial warmth slowly becomes mixed with a vague discomfort. Something in the honesty of the empath makes them feel smaller, less deep, less alive. And because they cannot face that feeling, their mind reaches for a familiar escape, turning insecurity into envy. Envy does not arrive like a storm. It comes very softly. It does not say, "I am jealous." It whispers, "You are too sensitive." It does not say, "I feel empty." It says, "You are making everything too serious." It does not attack directly. It slips through seemingly harmless comments, through silences that appear exactly when the empath needs support the most. The empath senses this shift before they understand it. A gaze that lingers a little less, a smile missing its familiar warmth, a silence that lasts longer than usual. And because empaths have carried emotional responsibility from a very young age, they turn inward to look for fault. They ask themselves if they are too much, if their honesty is tiring others, if they should be less deep, feel less, be less themselves. They do not realize that the problem is not that they feel too much, but that they reflect too clearly. Their light does not harm. It only reveals what has always been there, but has never been named. And from that moment, when light touches darkness without asking permission, a quiet movement begins to form within the relationship. Not loud, not dramatic, but enough to change everything that comes after. That change does not arrive with a clear collision. It comes the way the light in a room softens at the end of the day, when you only realize darkness has appeared after everything is no longer as sharp as before. The empath continues to be present as they always have. They keep listening, keep setting themselves aside to make space for the emotions of the other. But on the opposite side, something has already begun to shift. The other person no longer looks at the empath with the pure admiration from the beginning. The gaze is still gentle, still familiar, but behind it appears a very thin layer of tension, as if they are protecting themselves from something not yet named. At first, no one notices. Both continue to talk, to share things that seem intimate, but that intimacy slowly carries a strange aftertaste. The confessions no longer feel light. They become heavy, as if the other person is placing their entire inner world into the empath's hands. Then stepping back, the empath feels this. They feel themselves carrying a weight that does not belong to them, yet they do not know how to put it down. There is a moment that is very characteristic in relationships like this. It is when the empath shares something that truly touches them, not to seek attention, just a sincere emotion, a thought arising from depth, and instead of being received, they are met with a faint smile, an offbeat joke, or worse, silence. No one says it is wrong, no one shows anger, but the air in the room suddenly grows colder. The other person begins to say very familiar things, that the empath is too sensitive, that things are not that serious, that perhaps the empath is thinking more than necessary. These words are not spoken with obvious malice. They are wrapped in a caring tone, in a face that seems worried about the empath, and that is exactly what makes it hard for the empath to respond. Because if they do, they will feel as if they are being ungrateful to someone who is caring. But beneath that soft layer of language, another current is moving. It is envy. Even if no one names it, envy not because the empath has more, but because the empath lives more truthfully. The presence of the empath makes it impossible for the other to hide inside their familiar persona. It forces them to feel the empty spaces within themselves, the dry places they have covered for too long with busyness, with reason, with control. The empath does not ask the other to change. They do not demand an equal depth, but their authenticity alone becomes a challenge. It is like a question never spoken, yet hanging between them. Why can you not feel like this? Why do you have to strain so much to keep everything on the surface? And the other person, without an answer, begins to feel threatened. Envy now does not appear as hostility. It appears as an effort to make things smaller. The other person starts to downplay what the empath values. They laugh when the empath speaks about sadness. They change the subject when the empath touches something too real. They praise the empath in safer areas, but avoid the very depth that once attracted them, as if they are trying to keep the empath at a distance just far enough to avoid too much reflection. The empath feels this contradiction very clearly. On one hand, they are still needed. The other person still comes to them when tired, when needing comfort, when the outside world becomes too loud. But on the other hand, when the empath shines in their most natural way, when they live true to their depth, the warmth withdraws. Love becomes conditional, even though no one admits it. There is a very specific feeling that empaths often carry in relationships like this. It is the feeling of having to walk lightly, to choose words carefully, to adjust themselves so as not to make the other uncomfortable. The empath begins to shrink, not because they want to, but because they sense that their openness is making the other uneasy. And because they have been used to emotional responsibility since childhood, they choose to adapt. But the more they adapt, the more space envy has to live. Because every time the empath makes themselves smaller, the other avoids facing themselves. They no longer need to look into their inner emptiness, because the empath has quietly covered it for them. And deep down, this does not bring gratitude. It brings resentment, because the presence of the empath, even diminished, still reminds them that there is another way to live, a way they have not dared to step into. Envy is a strange emotion. It does not want to take the light. It wants to extinguish the light so the darkness feels more comfortable. And in this relationship, it begins to do its work very subtly. No conflict is needed. No harsh words are required. Only timely withdrawals, dismissals of emotion, glances lacking an invisible respect. The empath feels all of this like small ripples hitting their body. They cannot explain it, but they know. Their body knows before the mind can understand. Something is no longer right. Something is taking more than it gives back. But instead of leaving, the empath often stays longer. Because deep inside, they still believe that if they love enough, if they are patient long enough, everything will return to how it was in the beginning. And it is exactly at this point that the loop begins to close. The empath gives more to keep the connection. The other receives. But the more they receive, the more uneasy they feel. Envy grows in the dark, wearing the mask of care, wearing the mask of love. No one names it, no one faces it, but it exists in every silence, every sea, every sense of emptiness the empath carries home after each attempt to be closer. The relationship continues. On the surface, everything seems fine, but inside, a misalignment has formed. One side lives in emotional depth, the other tries to keep everything on the surface. And between them, envy begins its quiet work, preparing for consequences that neither is ready to face directly. Empaths often do not realize the moment they begin to burn out. It does not arrive as a clear collapse, but as a quiet fatigue, accumulating through each attempt to understand more, to give more, and to stay silent just a little longer. They are still there, still present. But inside a very strange emptiness begins to appear, an emptiness not because they are unloved, but because they are loving in a space where their own emotions have nowhere to rest. The other person still says the familiar words, still calls it care, still affirms that they love the empath in their own way. But the empath feels very clearly a subtle contradiction. When they listen, the other opens up. When they comfort, the other softens. But when the empath needs to be seen, when they bring out a very real part of themselves, the atmosphere shifts. There is a fleeting discomfort, very quick, but enough to make the empath's body tense. These moments repeat themselves, not serious enough to be called obvious harm, but persistent enough to erode trust. The empath begins to self-adjust. They choose to speak less about things that touch deeply. They hold their emotions back, not because they want to hide them, but because they are no longer sure they will be welcomed. They learn to smile when they feel sad, learn to nod when they feel misunderstood. And each time, a very small part of them quietly closes. There are nights when the empath lies still in the dark, trying to make sense of their feelings. They do not blame the other, because they are used to carrying emotional responsibility from very early on. They turn inward and ask themselves whether they are asking for too much, whether the desire to be deeply felt is a burden to others, whether living honestly with emotions is something that needs to be restrained to keep the peace. These questions have no clear answers, only leaving behind a lingering confusion. It is precisely in this state of confusion that empaths easily overlook very important signals. That love does not require someone to shrink. That care does not come with denying the other person's emotions. But because empaths are so accustomed to existing through adaptation, they keep trying. They believe that if they are patient enough, if they are gentle enough, the other will one day feel the depth they are avoiding. Occasionally, there are very brief moments when the other returns to the initial warmth. A compliment, a caring gesture, a look that seems to truly see the empath. These moments are like faint rays of light in a dark room, enough for the empath to hope that they were wrong, that everything will be fine, and they cling to these rays, even though most of the remaining time is still filled with a coldness that is hard to name. If you are listening into this story and feel something very familiar in it, perhaps you have also been in that state, the state of loving while doubting your own feelings. Sometimes, pausing for a moment to ask whether you are losing something or leaving a very honest thought of your own somewhere is also a way to begin seeing more clearly what is happening, not to judge anyone, but to no longer have to carry everything alone. Gradually, the empath begins to sense an uncomfortable truth, that the other not only cannot respond to their depth, but also feels threatened by it. The empath's sensitivity is no longer seen as something to be cherished, but as something that needs to be controlled. Advice appears more often. Comments about how the empath should be more realistic, stronger, not let emotions take over, start to slip into conversations that seem intimate. The empath hears these words with a very familiar feeling, because this is the same voice they heard in childhood, the voice telling them not to feel too much, not to cause trouble, not to ask for more, and without realizing when it happened, they begin to apply those words to themselves. They become the censor of their own emotions, doing the work the other no longer has to do. Envy at this point does not only exist outside, it begins to find its way inward. That envy does not say the empath is weak. It says the empath is too much, too deep, too complex, and because no one wants to become a burden, the empath tries to become easier to digest. They cut away the sharp edges, the long reflections, the intense emotions. But each time they cut something away, they also cut away a part of their own vitality. And their body responds with exhaustion, with emptiness that has no clear cause. The other person, on the opposite side, senses this change in a different way. When the empath shrinks, they feel more comfortable, less challenged, less reflected back at. But at the same time, they also begin to feel a sense of dullness. The vitality that once attracted them now gradually fades, and instead of recognizing that they themselves contributed to this, they feel a vague discomfort directed toward the empath, a sense that the empath has changed, has not been the same as before. This is a very fragile moment in the relationship. The empath stands between two unconscious choices. One is to continue shrinking to keep the connection, accepting exhaustion as the price for not being abandoned. The other is to begin listening to their own sense of burnout, even though that means facing the risk of losing what they once called love. Most empaths at this stage are still not ready for the second choice. They stay a little longer, they give a little more, and they convince themselves that love always requires sacrifice. But deep inside, something is quietly awakening, a very small question, but one that refuses to disappear. If this is love, why do I have to trade away so much of myself? That question has no answer yet. It simply rests there, silently, like a new crack beginning to form, signaling that a profound change is drawing closer than ever before. There is something very difficult to accept that the empath gradually begins to sense, even though they do not yet have the words to name it, that in this relationship, they are not only loving, they are playing a role, the role of the emotional regulator, the absorber, the soother, the one standing in the middle so everything does not collapse. And that role, over time, is no longer a choice. It becomes an invisible obligation. The other person increasingly relies on the presence of the empath. When they are tired, they come. When they are hurt, they need to be heard. When the world becomes too harsh, the empath becomes a refuge. But there is something very strange. That dependence does not come with appreciation. It is like breathing air. Only when it is gone do people notice it, while when it is there, it is taken for granted. The empath begins to feel more like a source of energy than a human being. There are moments that are very subtle, yet sharp enough to hurt. When the empath is tired and no longer has the strength to hold the other, the atmosphere grows heavy. The other may say nothing, but the disappointment is clear, as if the empath has failed to fulfill some kind of duty, and in that moment, the empath realizes a cold truth. They are loved not for who they are, but for what they provide. Envy has now changed its form. It is no longer only dismissive words or withdrawal. It begins to wear the shape of power. The other person, very unconsciously, wants to control how the empath feels. They advise the empath to think less, feel less, dig less deeply. They call it concern, wanting the empath to be better. But underneath, it is an effort to make the empath's presence less unsettling. The empath feels this as a vague pressure surrounding them. No one gives orders, no one forbids anything, but they feel they are no longer free to be themselves as before. There are topics they avoid mentioning. There are emotions they swallow back inside. There are very real parts of them that no longer come into the light, and each time, they comfort themselves by saying this is just a necessary adjustment in a mature relationship. But the body does not lie. The empath begins to feel exhausted in ways that are hard to explain. Not tired from working too much, but tired from constantly monitoring themselves. Tired from guessing how many % of their real self is allowed today. tired from keeping others stable by sacrificing their own inner stability. This exhaustion does not disappear with rest. It accumulates quietly, like water seeping through small cracks. The other person, meanwhile, begins to feel a different kind of discomfort. When the empath gradually shrinks, they feel safer, less reflected back at. But at the same time, they also feel something missing. The original vitality that once drew them in is no longer fully present, and instead of facing the truth that they themselves helped extinguish it, they turn to blame the empath, that the empath has changed, that the empath is no longer the same, that perhaps the empath has become distant. These words land on the empath like very small needles, not painful enough to cry out, but sharp enough to sink deep. Because the empath already carries an ancient fear, the fear of being abandoned if they are no longer useful, the fear that if they stop giving, they will no longer be needed. And so they try once more. They try to rekindle the warmth, to bring out the gentlest part of themselves, even though inside they are already very tired. It is here that the image of the wounded healer becomes clear. The empath is like someone who can soothe the pain of others simply by being present, yet does not know how to soothe themselves. They learn to endure far too early. They are used to feeling pain without calling it a problem. And that makes it easy for them to accept relationships where imbalance is disguised as love. There is a truth the empath has not yet dared to face. The other person does not truly want the empath to become freer, stronger in a complete sense. They want the empath bright enough to warm them, but not so bright that it exposes the dark corners they do not want to face. They need the empath, but they also resent that very need, and from that contradiction, envy continues to do its quiet work. Envy does not shout, it whispers. It makes the other feel that if the empath were less deep, everything would be easier. If the empath felt less, the relationship would be more stable. And the empath, out of love, out of fear of loss, out of old habits, agrees without realizing it. They think they are sacrificing for love, but in reality, they are repeating a very familiar pattern from the past. At a very deep level, the empath begins to feel a sadness unlike the ones before. Not sadness from being openly rejected, but sadness from being loved incompletely, being beside someone, but not fully received, being needed, but not truly seen. That sadness does not explode. It settles, sinks down, like a thick mist surrounding the heart. And within that mist, a question begins to form, growing clearer with time, whether love must necessarily wear a person down like this, whether empathy means enduring without limit. The empath does not yet have an answer, but for the first time, they begin to question the role they are playing, not questioning the other person, but questioning the very pattern that led them here. That doubt is not loud. It is like an undercurrent. But once it appears, it does not disappear. It stays there, quietly, waiting for the moment when the empath is tired enough to stop, heard enough to listen, and brave enough to face the truth that not every attachment is love, and not every sacrifice comes from free choice. The change does not come through a clear decision, but through very small signals the empath's body begins to send. Sleep is no longer as deep as before. Mornings arrive with a heaviness even without a clear reason. Sometimes they are sitting in the middle of a familiar conversation, listening to the other talk about their worries, and suddenly feel as if they are leaving the room from the inside. Not because they do not care, but because some part of them is so tired it can no longer absorb anything more. Dreams begin to appear, carrying a language the empath deliberately ignores during the day. There are dreams about water. The water rises very slowly, first reaching the ankles, then the knees, then the chest. In the dream, the empath keeps trying to swim, trying to keep their head above the surface, trying to pull others along. But the more they try, the heavier the water becomes. Their body grows sluggish, as if carrying a weight that does not belong to them. When they wake up, the feeling of suffocation still lingers. The empath does not understand why a dream can leave such a clear trace, but at a deeper level, they begin to realize that these dreams are not about water. They are about emotions, about having been in the current of others for so long that they forgot their own breath, about being so used to the role of rescuer that they did not realize they also needed to be saved. There are other dreams, quieter but no less haunting. The empath receives a gift wrapped beautifully. Delicate paper, neat ribbons, everything showing care, But when they open it, inside is emptiness, or worse, something already decayed. The empath wakes with a vague sadness, as if they have lost something they never truly had. During the day, they begin to look at their relationship with a different gaze. Not an accusing gaze, but the gaze of someone who dares to observe instead of rushing in. They notice that promises rarely come with action, that in moments when they most need support, silence appears. That love here always asks them to be strong, to understand, to give way, but rarely allows them to be weak. The empath is not ready to leave yet. They still hold hope, but this hope is no longer as naive as before. It begins to mix with clarity. They realize they have been living in a relationship where their emotions always need to be explained, justified, or softened to avoid discomfort. And for the first time, they ask why their honesty needs so much adjustment. The other person begins to sense this change, not because the empath speaks it, but because the empath no longer gives unconsciously as before. They are quieter. They no longer respond immediately. They spend more time alone. This makes the other uneasy. Comments begin to appear, gentle but sharp, that the empath is becoming distant, that the empath has changed, that perhaps the empath has become more selfish. These words touch a very sensitive place in the empath, because deep inside, they have always feared being hard to love, feared that if they stop giving, they will be left behind. But this time, their reaction is no longer the same. Instead of immediately apologizing or trying to make up for it, they feel a very clear exhaustion, not tired of the other, but tired of this familiar loop. The empath begins to realize that envy does not only come from dismissive words or control, it also comes from the other not wanting them to become emotionally independent. Because if the empath is no longer a container, the other will have to face themselves. And that, for them, is more frightening than losing this relationship. So they hold on, not with force, but with guilt. There are very small moments, but very clear. When the empath refuses to listen immediately, the other grows cold. When the empath needs space, the other calls it distance. When the empath sets a very gentle boundary, the other reacts as if betrayed. These reactions help the empath see that love here only exists when they continue to sacrifice, and a love that survives only through the erosion of one person is no longer love. The empath's body responds more strongly than the mind. They begin to feel tense at the thought of seeing the other, not because of dislike, but because of anticipation, anticipating that they will once again have to adjust themselves, anticipating that they will once again carry home emotions that are not theirs. And that anticipation itself is a warning, because love does not make a person shrink before meeting. In moments alone, the empath begins to remember distant parts of childhood, times when they had to guess whether the adults at home were in a good mood, times when they had to suppress their own needs to keep the peace. They realize that the current relationship is not an exception, but a repetition of an old pattern, and realizing this is both painful and liberating. Because if this is a pattern, it can be changed, not by fixing the other, but by stopping. For the first time, the empath allows themselves not to react immediately, not to explain, not to apologize, simply to feel their exhaustion without judgment. And in that silence, something very new appears, a feeling very faint, but very real. The feeling that they have the right not to continue. That feeling does not bring immediate relief. It brings fear. Fear of losing a familiar attachment, fear of facing emptiness without the role of healer. But alongside the fear, something else begins to emerge, a very small sense of self-worth, that their emotions also have value, that their presence is not an infinite resource for others to use. The empath does not yet call this a boundary. They simply call it tired. But this very tiredness is opening a door they never dared to touch before. A door leading to the most important question they have always avoided. If they stop sacrificing, who will they be left as? And that question, though frightening, is also the beginning of something very different, very real, waiting for them ahead. The emptiness that appears after the empath stops reacting is not filled immediately. It hangs between the two people, silent yet heavy. The empath begins to realize that for a very long time, they were the one constantly filling every gap, with words, with understanding, with being there at the right moment. When they stop, the silence is no longer covered, and the other person is forced to face it. The first reaction is usually not understanding. It is confusion. The other person feels disoriented when the empath no longer smooths everything over like before. They begin to ask more questions. But these questions are not meant to understand how the empath is feeling. They are meant to restore the old order. What happened? Why has the empath changed? Whether this relationship is still as safe as it once was. And within those questions, there is a deep fear. The fear of having to carry their own emotions. The empath hears those questions with a very different feeling. There is no longer the urge to immediately explain, to immediately reassure. They sense a very subtle separation happening inside. One part of them still wants to return to the familiar role, wants to say everything is fine, that they are just a little tired. But another part, quieter and more steady, begins to remain silent, not to punish, but to listen to themselves. That silence is not comfortable. It carries old guilt. The empath is used to being the agreeable one, the understanding one, the one who does not cause trouble. When they no longer respond right away, the old voice in their head begins to speak, that they are being selfish, that they are overreacting, that they should try a little harder. But this time, the empath does not rush to believe those voices. They recognize how familiar they are, and that very familiarity makes them pause. There are very small moments that are deeply important. When the other shares sadness, the empath feels it, but does not rush in to heal. When the other shows irritation, the empath does not try to soothe the atmosphere. They allow the other person's emotions to exist without absorbing them. This makes both of them uncomfortable, because this relationship has never operated this way before. The other person begins to react more strongly, sometimes with gentle blame, sometimes with coldness, sometimes with words carrying a sense of abandonment. They say the empath is no longer the same, that the empath has become distant, that perhaps the empath no longer loves. These words once held great power over the empath, but now they land somewhere else, a place that no longer reacts immediately, but quietly takes note. The empath begins to clearly see a truth they have long avoided, that the other person does not love their emotional freedom. They love the version of the empath who is always available, always understanding, always placing themselves last. When that version begins to fade, the relationship immediately becomes unstable, and this instability does not come from a lack of love, but from the old structure no longer being maintained. In long nights, the empath faces a very basic question. If they are no longer the one carrying emotions, who are they? This question frightens them more than any possibility of separation, because the role of healer has become an identity. Letting it go means stepping into unmapped territory, yet at the same time, they feel a very fragile sense of relief, as if something is finally being returned to its rightful place. The empath begins to look back at relationships throughout their life, not only the current one. A connecting thread slowly becomes visible. They realize they are often in the same role, the listener, the understanding one, the one who stays when others withdraw. And in every place, they feel tired in the same way, not because they give, but because they give without freedom of choice. Realizing this does not bring immediate liberation. It brings pain, because the empath must face their own shadow, the part that has grown accustomed to being needed, the part that built self-worth on sacrifice, the part that fears that without usefulness, they will not be loved. Looking directly at that part is deeply lonely, but it is also the first time the empath truly sees themselves. In the relationship, this change creates an unavoidable tension. The other person must either grow alongside or try to pull the empath back into the old position, and often they choose the second, not because they are bad, but because they are not ready. They need the empath as a container, not as an equal human being, and when the empath is no longer willing to take on that role, the relationship begins to crack. The empath feels the other person's pain, but this time, they do not rush to carry it. They allow that pain to exist where it belongs. This does not make them cold, it makes them clear. They begin to understand that compassion does not mean erasing oneself, that love does not require trading away one's wholeness. There are moments when they still waver, when the other appears vulnerable. The empath feels the pull to return to the old role. But then they remember the exhaustion that once accumulated. They remember the dreams of rising water. They remember the emptiness inside beautifully wrapped gifts. And they stay with their own silence a little longer. That silence is no longer empty like before. It begins to take shape, a personal space, where the empath can feel their own emotions without explanation. A place where they can be tired without permission. A place where they can exist without soothing anyone. At first, this space is very small, but each time the empath chooses not to return to the old role, it expands a little more. The other person may not understand this. They may leave. They may blame. They may try to hold the empath back in familiar ways, but the empath, though still afraid, though still hurting, begins to feel a very clear truth, that staying in a relationship where they must slowly disappear is the most dangerous thing of all. And it is precisely in this moment, when the empath allows everything to become uncertain, that a profound movement begins within them. Not loud, not dramatic, but strong enough to change the direction of an entire life. A movement away from unconscious sacrifice toward a different way of being, a place where they are no longer a container for the darkness of others, but begin learning how to stand firmly in their own light. The final fracture does not arrive as a loud tragedy. It comes in silence, like the soft closing of a door behind one's back. The empath no longer tries to keep everything the same. They do not argue to be understood. They do not justify themselves to stay. There is a fatigue so deep that every effort to prove becomes meaningless. And within that very letting go, something strange happens. Not emptiness, but space. That space is frightening at first. No one left to listen to, no one left to heal, no familiar role to cling to. But when the empath stays long enough with this quiet, they begin to hear another sound, their own breath, a rhythm they rarely noticed before, because they were always busy sensing the breath of others. Now, for the first time, their body is allowed to lead. With no one reflecting emotions for them to adjust to, the empath begins to experience the world in a new way. Colors become clearer, sounds become more distinct, emotions no longer overlap. Sadness, if it appears, is their own sadness. Joy, if it comes, no longer needs to be filtered to avoid making someone uncomfortable. Everything becomes simpler, not because life is easier, but because they no longer carry what does not belong to them. Judgments from the outside still exist. Some say they have changed. Some say they have become cold. Some say they are no longer the same. The empath hears these words like wind passing a window, without denying, without arguing, simply recognizing that each of those words reflects another person's loss, not the truth about them, and realizing this brings a very deep sense of freedom. The empath no longer needs to explain their sensitivity. They no longer have to prove that their emotions are reasonable. They no longer have to make themselves smaller to be left in peace. Empathy is still there. It has not disappeared, but it no longer overflows without condition. It becomes a conscious choice, placed in safe spaces, with people who know how to value it. A very quiet rebirth begins to happen inside, not an explosive joy, but a new stability. The empath feels themselves standing firmly on their own feet, no longer needing to be needed to confirm their worth. They begin to find joy in very small things. A quiet morning, sunlight through a window, a moment of not having to strain to understand anyone. When looking back at past relationships, the empath no longer feels resentment. They see people struggling with their own darkness, trying to love while not yet ready to face depth. Compassion remains, but without obligation. They no longer need to save anyone. And strangely, this does not close their heart. It makes it lighter. From this new place, the empath begins to realize that real love has a very different shape. It does not make you doubt your own feelings. It does not ask you to shrink to fit. It does not require you to sacrifice your wholeness to keep the peace. Real love expands you, makes you feel safe being yourself, even in your most fragile moments. The empath no longer seeks validation from outside eyes. They do not need anyone to name them, to assign them a role. They exist in a calm clarity, that they are allowed to feel deeply, that they are allowed to set boundaries, that they are allowed to leave places that no longer respect their vitality, not to escape, but to remain loyal to themselves. There are days they still feel lonely, but it is a different kind of loneliness, not loneliness among people, but the quiet of someone living in their own rhythm. In that quiet, they feel more whole than ever. No more tug of war between giving and holding back. No more choosing between love and self-protection. The two can now exist together. And as they step back into the world from this state, the empath realizes something simple yet powerful. Their light does not need to prove itself. It does not need to be understood by everyone. It only needs to be held steady. Because a light held through honesty with oneself cannot be shaken by any external gaze. They move forward, carrying no fear of judgment, no longer haunted by the need to be loved in the old way, carrying only the peace of someone who has returned to themselves. And within that peace, a quiet truth resonates, clearer than any affirmation: you were not born to be diminished in love. You were born to live fully in your own light.
Thank you for staying with me until the very end of this story. If this message touched your heart, please give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you'll never miss the next journey we take together. Your support means the world to me.